Well, I want to welcome you again as we continue our discussion of Jesus and the Gospels and the Kingdom of God. This is session number 4. Thank you for joining with me again. I began last time by looking at Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 9, and said this is perhaps the most difficult parable of Jesus in all of the Gospels, but we didn't answer the question, well, how do we understand this? So let's go back to Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 9, and read it again. And if you have a Bible, it might be really good tonight, especially in this episode, to follow along in your Bible, or if you have the ability, if you're on the computer or whatever, have your phone out, whatever it might be, and just kind of watch carefully what Jesus is doing and how Luke is framing the conversation. Luke 16, verse 1, he was saying to his disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager. This manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. He called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your managing, for you can no longer be my manager. The manager said to himself, what am I going to do? Since my master's taking the management away from me, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do, he said, so that when I'm removed from management, people will come will welcome me into their homes. He summoned each of his master's debtors, and he began saying to the first, how much do you owe, my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. He said, you know what? Take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill and write 80. And his master praised the unrighteous manager or steward because he had acted shrewdly. For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of the light. I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they'll receive you into eternal dwellings. Now, this is a very complicated passage, but it's critical. And I'm going to tell you right now, we're going to have a live stream in a few weeks on the issue of abortion. We're going to have some live streams on other topics, controversial topics. And I'm telling you right now, we need to frame those conversations in light of what Jesus is saying here. And I really believe that's the case. And I really think that we've kind of missed the boat a lot. And this is powerful and provocative. So the first thing to notice is that chapter 16, verse 1 is continuing a scene from the previous chapter. So, Luke chapter 16, verse 1 begins by saying, now he was also saying to the disciples. Now, it doesn't mean that the chapter break is a bad thing. In Luke, the sections are so long, you have to put chapter breaks. Otherwise, the chapters will be like hundreds of verses. But when we often read or do a Bible study or whatever, like today I'm going to read Luke 16, and when we do that, we might miss the fact that the story here is connected to something previously. In fact, the story here goes back at least to chapter 15, even if not to chapter 13 or 14. In chapter 15 of the Gospel of Luke, it says, now, verse 1, all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to Jesus to listen to him. But the Pharisees and scribes began to grumble, which is a description of the Pharisees and scribes like the Israelites in the wilderness who grumbled at Moses, saying, all we have to eat is this manna. It's the same language in the Greek as the Greek version of the Old Testament. And it says, the Pharisees and scribes began to grumble, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So he told them this parable, saying, now, we might stop and think, well, this parable in verse 3 is like one parable. But what you'll notice is that verses 4 through 7 tells a parable of the lost sheep. In verse 8, if you have a red letter Bible, you might notice that it's all red letters. There's no statement of Luke or anything like. Jesus just continues verse 7 into verse 8. Most Bibles have a little heading, the parable of the lost coin above verse 8, but the text just continues. Or what woman? And it's the parable of the lost coin. Now, verse 11 tells the parable of what we often call the prodigal son, which should be titled the parable of the lost son. And verse 11 says, and he said. So there's three black words, 3 words in black letters, and that's Luke's insertion of, and he said, a man had 2 sons. But what you'll notice is that these 3 parables actually work together. All right. First off, they're all interrelated. The transitions are there. In each of the 3 parables, someone loses something. A man loses 1 out of 100 sheep. A woman loses 1 out of 10 coins. Another man loses 1 out of 2 sons. And you'll notice it's 1 out of 100, 1 out of 10, 1 out of 2. And then, of course, what was lost is found. And each of the 3 go, rejoice with me. And they throw a party. It's not clear that they throw a party in the first 2 parables, but it's really clear in the third one that they the father throws a party. And it's a banquet. Rejoice with me, because that which was lost was found. Then chapter 16, verse 1. Now he was also saying to the disciples, So the three parables in chapter 15 were all spoken to the Pharisees and the scribes who were grumbling. Why does this man eat with tax collectors and sinners? And Jesus' answer is, well, I had to eat with them because they were lost and now they're found. But then he turns to the disciples and begins to speak to them. So the parable of the unjust steward that we're looking at, that's so difficult, the first thing to notice is that it's directed to the disciples, but it has in mind the conversation with the Pharisees and religious leaders of the previous passage. Then you'll notice in chapter 16, verse 14, now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all these things. I mean, the parable of 6, 1 through 9 that Jesus was speaking to his disciples, and he keeps talking to them in verses 10 through 13. All of a sudden now the Pharisees were listening, and they were scoffing at him. And Jesus said to them. So verse 15, Jesus now turns back to the Pharisees. So Pharisees and scribes, 3 parables. The disciples, a parable. Back to the Pharisees, who are lovers of money. And so notice again now, the conversation explicitly describes money. And then verse 19. Now again, my Bible has a little heading, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. But there's no words in black letters here. Jesus just continues on, meaning he's still speaking to the Pharisees. There's a rich man, and there's a poor man named Lazarus. So we'll look at that as we proceed. So very important to understand that Jesus is going back and forth. And then the section actually continues in chapter 17, where it says in verse 1, he said to his disciples. So back to the disciples now. And it's like, it'd be better, woe to those whom the stumbling blocks come. It'd be better for them to have a millstone thrown around their neck and be drowned in the sea than to cause one of these little ones to stumble. Be on your guard. Okay. And then the apostles say in verse 5, Lord, increase our faith. And the section then ends in verse 10. So this is the larger section that we're dealing with, and I think it's really important to understand what's going. So the first question then becomes, why are you eating with these people? And in verse 32 is explicitly answers that question, the 3 parables of chapter 15. I think actually this says Luke 16. It should say Luke 15. So that's Luke 15, verse 32. We had to celebrate and rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead and has begun to live, and was lost and has been found. So that's the 3 parables of chapter 15. Something's lost and it's found. That's why he's eating with tax collectors and sinners. They were lost, but now they're found. But what do we do with this parable of the unjust steward? What does this mean? Well, what happens in this parable then, chapter 16 now, is there's a rich man, an owner, who finds out that his manager, you can think of a manager like something like a general manager. The guy's really, really rich because somebody owes him 100 measures of oil. Somebody else owes him 100 measures of wheat. He's very, very wealthy. He probably has several managers. And these managers, oversee the businesses and everything else and the income and what have you. Well, this manager's not been doing poor work. So the rich man says, guess what? Yeah, you're in trouble. Now, in the Gospel of Luke, the rich man is often portrayed negatively. That's the first thing to understand. How does Luke understand rich man throughout? And we notice Luke 6, verse 24 that we read in our last episode. Woe to you who are rich. In Luke 12, verse 16, there's a parable of the rich man who stored up all of his goods, and he built these containers. And the parable goes like, you fool. This night, your very life is going to be asked of you. And of course, in chapter 16, 19 through 31 that I alluded to, there's a parable of the rich man and Lazarus. So there's a rich man, and he's going to fire the steward. And the steward goes, what am I going to do? Because I'm not strong enough to dig. I can't do manual labor, and I'm ashamed to beg. So I don't know what to do. Let me get that off the screen. What am I going to do? And then he goes, I know what I'll do. This is what I'm going to do. So that when I'm removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. Now, if you haven't listened to the previous episode, I encourage you strongly to go do so. The last 5 to 10 minutes, I began discussing this honor and shame culture and the idea of reciprocity and debt and obligation and patron clients and how that worked in the Roman world. But basically what this guy's going to do is this. He's got a plan. And in this plan, the people he's going to do favors for are going to now owe him. And when he loses his position from his manager, the people that now owe him are going to welcome me into their homes. So he's got it figured out. I'll go work for them. I did a favor for you. You owed my master 100, I made it 80. You owe my master 100, I made it 50. Now my master fired me. Guess what? You owe me. And in that culture, that's the way it would work. You would be in his debt because he did a favor for you and wiped out some of your debt. And now you have to bring him in. And likely, if you owe 100 measures of wine, 100 measures of grain, you also have some measure of stature yourself. So this guy's finding a way to make sure he's got a job and even a place to live at the end of the day. Now, we're troubled by this parable, Luke 16, 1-9. We're troubled by this parable because it seems that Jesus is praising an unjust steward. The problem would be this. The hearers of the parable would not have understood Jesus as commending the dishonest practices. In fact, Jesus actually identifies the steward as an unrighteous steward. We're in Luke 16, verses 1-9. The man's commended for his shrewdness, which is the same word, by the way, referring to the devil in Genesis chapter 3. The devil was more shrewd than any of the other creatures of the earth. But Jesus is not commending him for his dishonest practices, or in the parable, the man's not being commended for dishonest practices. The parable, the key to understanding the parable, though, is this. It contrasts the sons of the light and the sons of this age. So Luke 16, verse 8 says, for the sons of this age, the sons of the world, are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of the light. These guys are shrewd, and you need to be shrewd. You need to be wise like them. Jesus is saying, this is how the world does it. That's not how we do it in my kingdom, but I do want you to be shrewd in my kingdom. Just don't be shrewd for your own selfish ambitions. Remember, he was shrewd because he got himself a job when his manager fired him. He was not shrewd because he took care of his manager's stuff really well and made his owner money. He undermined his owner's business, but he did it for his own self-gain, and he profited from it. Jesus then turns in verse 9 and says, here's what I want you to do. Jesus says, I want you to use money to make friends. I don't have this on as a lower third, but it's Luke 16, verse 9. I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they'll receive you into eternal dwellings. Make friends by means of the wealth of unrighteousness with money. Use it shrewdly to make friends, so that when it fails, they'll receive you into eternal dwellings. Now, making friends, the word friends could refer to anybody that's an equal or a lesser or a greater. Friends were often clients, though the term friend might be used instead of a client because it's, embarrassment of like, hey, that's my client, I'm the patron, that's my slave, basically, that's a servant of mine. So you might be called a friend, but using money to make friends refers to a socio-economic reality. It doesn't mean buy yourself some friends. It means using money to place people in your debt, but not the way the unjust steward did it. Not that way. He says, that man used his master's money to gain friends who responded to him by taking them into their homes and gave them employment and a place to stay. But Jesus is saying, I want you to make friends with the mammon of unrighteousness, that they can receive you into eternal dwellings. In other words, make friends now, but not so that they would reciprocate now, but so that they will reciprocate in eternity. Remember what Jesus says in Luke 6, 32-35. Give without expecting anything in return. So, as I said in our last live stream, Luke 6 is the key to understanding the Gospel of Luke, and everything that follows in the Gospel of Luke is going to explain and describe and depict and illustrate what Jesus is talking about in Luke chapter 6. Give without expecting anything in return. The steward gave and expected a job and a housing after he got fired. Jesus is saying, you know what? Give so they can receive you into eternal dwellings. In other words, give to those who can't pay you back now. In other words, as the slide says, they should use money to make friends among the poor, even though they can't pay you back, because they will receive you into eternal dwellings. They can pay you back in eternity. Remember, blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Now, Jesus goes on. Chapter 16, verses 14 and 15. I hope that explains the parable of the unjust steward. He's not praising the unjust steward for his bad dealings. He's saying, you know what? You were shrewd. Good move on your part for your own sake, but my people don't do it that way. My people are going to do it so that we welcome people into the kingdom who can't pay you back now, but will pay you back in eternity. Verse 14 and 15. Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all these things, and they were scoffing at him. And he said to them, Jesus goes on to tell a parable, essentially, another story. Like, yeah, you guys, there's some problems here. And again, money was often a means to social status. And Jesus is saying to them, you know what? You're more concerned with your social status than you are with your responsibility to the poor. You're more concerned with your own well-being than you are with your responsibility to the poor. You're more concerned about where you're going to eat, and how you're going to care for yourself than you are for the poor. Remember Matthew chapter 6, as we discussed at our 2 live streams ago, and that is, why do you worry about food? Why do you worry about clothing? Well, because if I do what you tell me, Jesus, I don't have food for myself. If I give to those who ask without expecting anything in return, I might eat tonight, but what am I going to do tomorrow? Then Jesus goes on, chapter 16, verses 19 through 31, to tell the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, there are no words in black letters here. In Luke chapter 16, verses 18 and 19, he just keeps talking to the Pharisees. Now, there's a rich man. Verse 19, he habitually dressed in purple and fine linen and joyously living in splendor every day. A poor man named Lazarus was laid at his gate, covered with sores, and longing to be fed with the crumbs which were falling from the rich man's table. Besides, even the dogs were coming and licking his sores. Now, the poor man died. Remember the eschatological reversal I discussed in the last live stream. The poor man died, was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom. And Abraham's bosom refers to sitting at the right hand of Abraham at the banquet. When you lean back to talk to Abraham, you're laying on your left side. When you lean back to speak to Abraham, you're in his chest. That means you're at Abraham's right-hand side. You're the honored guest at the banquet of Abraham. So the poor man died, was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom, and the rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, he lifted up his eyes, being in torment. And he saw Abraham far away and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried out. He still thinks he's the rich man. And he still thinks that beggar Lazarus is a servant. Go, boy, go do what I asked you to do, boy. Look what he says. Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus over here so he can dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue because I'm in agony in this fire. Lazarus, come here, help me out. Abraham said, my child, remember that during your lifetime you received good things, and likewise Lazarus received bad things. But now he's being comforted and you are in agony. And besides all this, there's a chasm. Between you and us, there's a chasm fixed so that those who want to come over from here to you will not be able to, and no one may cross over there from there to us. And he said, well, then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, in order that he may warn them, so they will not also come to this place of torment. Abraham said, you know what? They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. But he said, no, Father Abraham, if someone goes to them from the dead, they'll repent. And he said, you know what? If they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't be persuaded even if someone rises from the dead. There's a rich man who lived in luxury. And there's a poor man named Lazarus. The rich man was well clothed in purple garments. And a purple robe was like the highest, extremely expensive. Lazarus was covered in sores, and his sores contrast the clothes of the rich man. The rich man had a daily banquet. Nobody has banquets every day. This guy's like flaunting wealth. Lazarus longed to eat the crumbs that fell from his table. Besides, even the dogs licked his sores. Of course, the rich man's home was wealthy at a gate that Lazarus laid by, which suggests an estate. Lazarus has no home. He's sitting at the gate. Maybe he's even a cripple. And they experience what we discussed in the last live stream of this eschatological reversal. Their fate is reversed in eternity. And again, don't be too simplistic here. Jesus is not saying that all rich people go to hell, all poor people go to heaven. That's not the point. The rich man then pleads, send Lazarus over here. Sorry, can't do it. He thinks his position of privilege is still going to carry with him into the afterlife. Nope, sorry, I can't do it. Well, let's send Lazarus. Nope, sorry, I can't do it. They'll believe. Nope, if they don't believe Moses and the prophets, they won't believe even if someone rises from the dead. In neglecting the poor, the rich man has disregarded the will of God clearly expressed in the scriptures, and so has his family. He wants Lazarus to go prove to them that this place is real. And this is what Moses has already proved to it's real. Go do what Moses says. And what Moses says, as I mentioned in the last live stream, is that there should be no poor among you. Now notice again, as I mentioned already, the story doesn't end. In Luke 17, verse 1, he said to his disciples, it's inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to him to whom they come. I can't tell you how important I think this is for the church today. I said in the first couple live streams, and I'll go further in this as we move along on these Thursday night live streams, that I think the Western Evangelical Church has largely, not absolutely, not wholly, not everybody's condemned to hell. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying there are no good churches, but I think largely as a movement, the Western Evangelical Church has given in to the nation, to the empire, to the beast, to wealth, to power, to prosperity, and we are undermining the very gospel of Jesus Christ. I think we've sold ourselves to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I encourage you to listen to the podcast that went live this week, the interviews, which would be the week of July 23rd, I think, or 22nd, I think it was, of 2024. Interviews with Wes Howard Brooke, part 1 and part 2. We talk about this. What does this mean in light of the book of Revelation? I think we've sold ourselves to empire, and we look more like the Pharisees and the rich man. And I think when Jesus says, woe to those whom stumbling blocks come, I think he's speaking to us. The one who caused one of these little ones to stumble. Well, these little ones is Lazarus. The little ones is the prodigal son, the brother that was lost. The little ones, the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame in Luke chapter 14, verses 12 to 14. Jesus is referring to the injustices and the indifferences to inhospitality on behalf of the needy. I'll say it again. He's referring to the injustices and indifferences to hospitality on behalf of the needy. His answer is, it's better that they drowned, that a millstone be tied around their neck and they drowned, than to cause one of the rich ones, one of these little ones to stumble. And the disciples turn to Jesus and say, okay, I'm not sure I get this, but Lord, increase our faith. Lord, increase our faith. The disciples, I said a couple live streams ago, in John chapter 6, Jesus gives this really hard, difficult teaching. He says, you have to eat my flesh, or you have no part with me. And they're like, what is that supposed to mean? And then it says near the end of John 6, it says, many deserted, many fell away from him. When Jesus' teachings get hard, what do? Do we say, Lord, increase my faith so I can understand this and do what it says? Or like, yeah, no, not for me. Lord, increase our faith. Jesus then turned to the disciples in John 6 and says, do you want to go also? And the disciples are like, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. The disciples ask for their faith to be increased so that they can live up to these standards. Lord, make us faithful people. Help us not to live so as to cause these little ones to stumble, so as not to be faithful, so that we can be faithful with the unrighteous mammon. What we have in the teachings of Jesus is a contrast between the ways of the nations and the way of Jesus's kingdoms. Now, how this applies in our contemporary world is difficult. And I don't think we should just immediately, as I've said a couple times already, read Jesus in light of our particular economic or political system. But we have to read Jesus and then figure out what this means. I do think that Jesus' concern centers on obtaining wealth at the expense of the poor and not using that wealth to help alleviate the conditions that contribute to poverty. Now, many of you might say, well, I didn't obtain my wealth at the expense of the poor. But I think we need to be careful. The church needs to be shrewd to use wealth properly and not unjustly. The theme is faithfulness to God, and it's demonstrated by hospitality to the poor. Hospitality actually manifests itself by sometimes redistributing our wealth, and that might have all kinds of political, and I don't mean for it to do so. redistributing our wealth to those who are incapable of paying us back. Creating friendships and relationships across social boundaries, because they might not pay us back now, but they will be able to pay us back in eternity. If the unrighteous can use money to gain friends, then so can we. But we should use our money to cancel the debts of the poor and to gain their friendship. Since they can't repay us now, they'll receive us into their homes in eternity. All right. Again, if you've been enjoying these, I encourage you to leave questions or comments. Feel free to email me at rdownapple19@gmail.com. Again, like the episodes, subscribe to the channel, send them out, leave comments. All that helps with the algorithms there as well. We've got a couple extremely significant live streams coming up on Saturday morning of July 27, 2024. We're going to be interviewing Karunakar and Gayatri Reddy, a pastor and his wife, just phenomenal leaders, unbelievable stories. Both converts to Christianity from a non-Christian, from a Hindu background, just tremendous stories. And then on Tuesday of next week, we're going to continue our Israel-Gaza conversations and the war in Gaza, what's going on with two Jewish leaders. We had them on a couple weeks ago, and we're going to try the conversation again. Hey, help us understand, how do we critique and criticize Israel and the United States, what it's doing, without being anti-Semitic? So all that can be found on the determinedtruth.com homepage or by subscribing to the Determined Truth YouTube page. Thank you very much. There will be no Thursday night live stream next week, but we will be back in a few weeks. Stay tuned for announcements on that.